Hey class, this is the second chapter of actually the third chapter of U.S. history. This is a new time period. I really like this time period. I'm not saying I would take a time machine and go back to this time period, but this is the time period of about maybe between maybe 1900 till about 1920. Okay, maybe a little bit earlier than that, but we call this progressivism. Now, think about the word progressivism. What is the root of progressivism? And that's always a question I like to ask of new words. Okay, so if you look at the word progressivism, is there a word in there? Look at that, progress. This is a time period of progress. Now, of course, let me clarify. What I mean by progress is that life is getting better for the average person. Okay? It's getting cleaner, it's getting safer. Instead of working, let's say, 14 hours a day, 6 days a week, now people are working 8 hours a day, 5 days a week. Now that's progress. That's because of the labor unions, which have been working since the Gilded Age. Okay? So progressivism, and if you need to write this down, go for it, but you need to know that this is the time period called progressivism. It is a series of reform movements during the early 1900s. Okay? And I like to show you color pictures as much as I can. This is a postcard from Chicago. Okay? If you want to pause and write this down, that's a good idea. You should be taking notes. Okay? All right. Now, so what are we going to talk about in this chapter? It's going to take a couple of days, but the progressives were a bunch of reformers, and they wanted to change the country. They wanted temperance. Now, what is that? They wanted to get rid of alcohol. Okay? We will talk about that in a second. They wanted to reform the corrupt government. They wanted women's suffrage, the vote. They wanted better, safer, shorter, better paid working conditions. And they wanted more government regulation. Now, government regulation sounds bad, but when companies get to just do whatever they want without any kind of government interference, then people aren't as safe. Remember the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire at the end of that video I showed you? That's what we're trying to avoid. Okay? So if you are in the modern day, what you would call yourself a liberal, then you might agree with the goals of progressivism. I think even conservatives would agree with this too. Sometimes we need the right amount of government. Okay? Not too much, not too little. Okay, so let's get started. All right, I have never seen this on the test, but it is on the list. Don't expect a lot of questions from me about this. Just write down the red if you want. What is social gospel? It was a bunch of people. Imagine this. Imagine people going to church every Sunday and trying to convince rich people to donate their money to causes. Okay? So social meaning people, gospel meaning the Bible. Social gospel is, so they would be like, hey, Carnegie, helping the poor is what Jesus would do. Can you donate $1 million to this cause? Okay, and that's exactly what Carnegie did. This will lead to philanthropy. I'll tell you what that is on the next slide. Outlawing child labor. Don't hire children to work in your factories. And that's another goal of the progressives, is to get the kids in school, get them out of the factories. And the prohibition of alcohol. We'll talk about that in a second. This is going to be on your test, on your 6 weeks test, but it will not be on your EOC, so I don't want to make too big of a deal out of it. But philanthropy is kind of like charity. So people like Carnegie would take millions of dollars and put them into causes. For example, this is Carnegie Hall in New York City. This is what it looks like today. Carnegie also funded libraries, public libraries, which were a really big deal back then. I mean, imagine being an immigrant and you could go to a library and actually educate yourself for free. And it's for everyone, not just for the rich people. Wow, America is great. You can actually educate yourself to make yourself a better person for free because of people like Andrew Carnegie. The government didn't fund things like this. It was rich people like Carnegie and Rockefeller and other rich people. Rich people that I've never heard of. Okay? Okay, all right. All right. Now, I need you to write this down, okay? Jane Addams. Jane Addams was a social gospel reformer, okay? And she was one of the richest, she was one of the first educated women in this country. I think she was one of the first women to ever get a PhD in the United States. She was one of them, okay? And so I want you to think back then, what kind of jobs are there for women? Okay? There aren't a lot of jobs back then for women, especially educated women. Okay? So another thing that you might find interesting is she was a lesbian. So what is a lesbian with a PhD supposed to do with herself? You know, she's not going to get married and have a bunch of kids back then. I mean, she might. You know, a lot of women did that, but the point is that what is she going to do? Well, what she did was her and her girlfriend, she would go and ask millionaires for money to donate money to what are called her settlement houses. Okay? I want you to think of a settlement house as like an elementary school for little kids. So these immigrant kids would go to these settlement houses and, you know, they don't speak English, you know, and they don't read or write. And she would teach them basic education. And thus, and you need to know what this means, help them to assimilate to American society. Okay? So by teaching them English and teaching them to read or write and teaching them basic skills, she is helping these kids to assimilate into American society. So she provided basically what we would consider an elementary school education. Okay, hit pause if you want to write this down. You need to know Jane Addams. Okay. All right, so her most famous settlement house was called the Hull House, and it was founded by Miss Jane Addams and Miss Ellen Gates Starr. It is used to promote and maintain educational and philanthropic enterprises as a means of advancing social and civic life in the industrial center of Chicago. So basically, it's like an elementary school funded by philanthropists, rich people, like Carnegie, Rockefeller, Vanderbilt, J.P. Morgan, and other rich people that we haven't heard of. All right, so let's try some multiple choice. Which of these was a major goal of Jane Addams' settlement house movement in Chicago? Okay, hit pause if you want some more time, but the answer is C, the assimilation of immigrants. Also to provide them a basic education, but that is assimilation really. All right, I want to talk to you about the temperance movement, and you do need to know the word temperance movement, okay? Now, I think this picture was a joke. What they did was they took the ugliest women they could find and said, "These lips that touch liquor shall not touch ours." I think this was a joke. It really was, okay? But that doesn't mean that the spirit wasn't there. Women had a good reason for wanting alcohol to be banished from this country. There are a lot of good reasons. First of all, I want you to understand that it was the women who did it. And what's really impressive about women is that they did this without the right to vote. Okay, they could not vote yet they managed to get a constitutional amendment passed. That is an incredible feat of politics, to be able to do that without having the right to vote. But I want you to understand something about alcohol of the time. America had a really bad drinking problem. I mean, it was bad. And it goes back 100 years. Men would work 6 days a week. And the only place to get their check cashed was the bar sometimes. So they would go to the bar with their money. And what would happen is they would get a drink, and they would sit down at a table with like 12 people at it. And then somebody would buy a round for the whole table, so that somebody would buy 12 drinks. Now, I want you to understand something. When you're at a table and somebody buys a round for the whole table, then you are socially obligated to also buy a round for the whole table. Okay? And so what that really means is that if you're sitting at a table of 12 people, then you're going to end up having 12 drinks. That's a lot of alcohol. And so men would go home Saturday night, and and I'm sorry to tell you, but they would abuse their wives and their children. They would come home drunk. It happened all the time. Or sometimes they would come home Sunday morning and say, "I'm sorry, honey, I spent our entire paycheck." So imagine your husband does this, and you got literally 9 kids to feed, and your husband spent his entire check on alcohol. What are you supposed to do? I mean, really, what are you supposed to do? You know, the only thing that they could do was go get the preacher of the local church to have a talk with the man. But that was about it. There wasn't a lot that you could do back then. So what people started to think, and you could see kind of how they came to this conclusion, is that alcohol was of the devil and that it was a drink of Satan. And forget the fact that Jesus drank wine. I mean, you know, you can forget about that. But alcohol, it must be Satan's drink, and we need to get rid of it. I'm not saying that this is true now. I'm just saying that this was the line of thinking behind women at the time. Women would get together and they would go to bars, and they would just go into bars and start singing church hymns. Imagine you're in a bar trying to get your buzz on, and a bunch of women in their Sunday clothes come in and start singing, "Onward, Christian soldiers." And you're like, oh man, come on. And some men would actually take the message and stop drinking. Some bars would shut down for a day. Some men would like pour drinks on the women and get mad at the women and stuff. There were all kinds of reactions. It got violent sometimes. Sometimes the women would get violent. This is Carrie Nation. Her husband died of alcoholism. And she's like, I have nothing to live for. So she would take a tomahawk axe, and go to bars and go behind the counter and just bust up everything. She's been to jail a few times, but she's like, zero F's given. She did not care. Her husband was dead and alcoholic, and she thought alcohol was the enemy. And you can kind of see why. Here is an anti-alcohol cartoon, a temperance cartoon. Look at the title. The Poor Man's Club, the most expensive in the world to belong to. So here's this man, week's wages, giving his money to the bar, while at home, the wife is in despair. a club member in good standing paying his dues. So you can see this is a cartoon that is supportive of the temperance movement. Here's another one. We make people poor. This is booze, okay? We cause poverty and crime. We are against progress. We rob women and children. We waste grain. That's a bit of a stretch, but you get my point. We fill penitentiaries and asylums, crazy houses, jails. So, they seem to have a pretty good argument. And slowly, states started to outlaw alcohol. And eventually, the temperance movement had success. You need to write this down, and you need to memorize these two amendments. The 18th Amendment outlawed alcohol. But then in the 1930s, the 21st Amendment got rid of the 18th Amendment. So the 18th Amendment doesn't exist anymore. The 21st Amendment repealed the 18th Amendment. All right, so it was a success. So throughout the 1920s, alcohol was illegal. We'll talk about that later, but I'm trying to tell you about the temperance movement, and it was part of progressivism. Okay? Moving right along. You need to write this down, and you need to know what this word means. What is ratification? To ratify a law or to ratify an amendment, it needs to be signed, dated, stamped, and legally, that's when it comes into action. So if the 18th Amendment were ratified, that means that it became an amendment. All right, so check this out. Which of these contributed to the ratification of the 18th Amendment? The answer is the women, the growing political influence of women. It was an incredible success of women to do that without the right to vote. Moving right along. Now let's talk about political reforms. Progressives wanted big business out of politics. They also wanted to get rid of the political machines. Yes, the political machines were helpful to immigrants, but the political machines were corrupt. And that is not how we operate in this country. One of the famous political machines was the Tammany Ring of New York City, and that is Boss Tammany. He was like the governor. No, he was like the mayor of New York. All right, he was the boss. And look how everyone is pointing at everyone else. He did it, he did it, he did it, he did it. And the point is that this is not how you run a government. Again, remember, they did help immigrants, but they were corrupt. All right, write this down. What is the spoils system? This is the problem with political machines. The spoils system is when you give jobs only to your friends and only to people who helped you get elected. Yeah, you helped the boss get elected, so I'm going to give you a job. I'm going to make you garbage commissioner. Yeah, you don't know anything about the garbage commissioner. You don't know anything about that stuff. But you got the job because you helped the boss get elected. That is the spoils system. And yeah, we still have that in our government today to some extent. To a pretty big extent, actually. Okay. Now, how are we going to get rid of the spoils system? We're going to have what's called civil service reform. You need to write this down. Civil service reform is this. If you want to work for the government, you need to take a civil service exam, or you at least need to apply for the job. Fill out an application and apply for it and get the job based on your qualifications. The merit system. So that's how the progressives are going to get rid of the political machines, is have a merit system. Write this down. I'm moving on. Hit pause, but I'm moving on. Even today, we have civil service exams. You should look into it. If you take the civil service exam, you can qualify for certain jobs in government. Okay, I don't know much about it, but you should look into it. Okay? Some jobs require a certain score on the civil service exam. Okay? It's kind of like the ASVAB in the military. The ASVAB is kind of like a civil service exam. You take the ASVAB, and then that qualifies you for certain jobs in the military. All right. I don't think this is an easy question, but let's take a look at it. So you've got a cartoon, and look at Uncle Sam. Look at his eyes. Look how mean he looks. And look, it says free pie kitchen. And Uncle Sam is giving pie to all these overweight men. Now remember, back then, overweight meant rich. Back then, poor people were skinny and rich men were overweight. Okay, keep that in mind. So read this. Which issue is this cartoon addressing? So issue, meaning problem. What problem is this cartoon addressing? So make sure that your answer is a problem. Make sure that your answer is an issue. And the answer is political corruption. So Uncle Sam is the symbol of the United States of America, and it's being corrupt by giving all this free pie to all these rich people. Civil service reform is how we're going to get rid of this political corruption. So I understand why C was a tempting answer, but A is the answer, and C is the answer to how do you get rid of political corruption, or at least an attempt. All right. The cartoon refers to the corruption and greed of the politicians using the spoils system to increase their own power. What reform provided a solution to this problem? Okay, so the problem is the spoils system. What is the solution to that problem? And look at that, Boss Tammany. The answer is civil service reform. That's how we're going to get rid of the spoils system. All right, write this down. What is recall? You know how, like, you have, well, a recall in terms of politics is when you get a corrupt politician, and what happens is the people get together, have a special election to get them out of office. So imagine you're the governor of Wisconsin, and the people decide that they want to have a recall election because they don't like what you're doing as governor. You get a bunch of signatures, like 100,000 signatures, something like that, and then you have a special election. And then based on that, so instead of waiting for 4 years to get reelected, they don't want to wait. They want to have a special election after you've been in office for a couple of years. And if you lose, then the governor loses the job. That's happened in Wisconsin, and it happened in California and other places. So think of a safety recall, okay? You want to bring it back. You know, your car has a safety recall. You need to take it to the dealership and get it fixed. So you need to call it back. Well, same thing with politicians. You're a bad politician, so you need to be called back. Recall. It happened in California about 20 years ago. There was a governor of California. He lost the recall election, and that's when Arnold Schwarzenegger became governor of California because of a recall election. I need you to write this down. Hit pause and write this down. So the theme here is more power to the people. Let me repeat, more people power. An initiative is when a bunch of people get enough signatures to put something on the ballot, meaning for it to be voted on. In 2016, the state of Maine had an initiative to raise the minimum wage to $15 an hour. Okay? Because the people, not Congress, but the people decided that they wanted that to put to a vote. So during this time, I want you to know that the state governments were corrupt, and an initiative was a way for the people to have more power. And the corrupt state governments, like in Austin, for example, the state governments have not quite so much power. So an initiative, you get a bunch of signatures. A referendum is actually what's on the ballot. So when you go vote, yes, you vote for president, you vote for senator, you vote for your representatives, but you will also vote for referendums. And it could be very local, like let's vote to whether or not we can sell wine and beer at Tom Thumb. Because, 15 years ago in Oak Cliff, you couldn't do that. You had to go to an actual liquor store to do that. Now you could buy wine and beer at Tom Thumb. There was a referendum, and it passed. So initiative is getting the signatures to introduce the bill. Referendum is what's on the ballot. And finally, secret ballot. Remember the political machines? You better vote for the boss or there's going to be hell to pay. Now, the secret ballot means you can vote and nobody knows who you voted for. That's the secret ballot. So it's anonymous. So you want to vote for Trump, you want to vote for Biden, I'll never know who you voted for. It's none of my business and I'll never know. Back then, though, everybody knew who you voted for, and that allowed the political machines to run everything. So remember this, more people power, okay? All right, write down the red. What is the 17th Amendment? So in every state has 2 senators, and the 2 senators used to be chosen by the state Congress, like down in Austin. So back in the day, the Austin Congress would choose who our senators were that would go to the United States Senate in Washington, D.C. Because of the 17th Amendment, the people elect the senators. Remember what I said, more people power. The 17th Amendment allows the people to elect these senators. And these are your 2 senators. Remember I talked about Ted Cruz, about how his father was Cuban, yet Ted Cruz is a nativist? That's who I was talking about. John Cornyn in 2020, he's running for re-election right now. Okay? Write this down. What is the 16th Amendment? Its ratification led to the income tax. So the 16th Amendment means that people who have an income have to pay taxes on that income. Remember Andrew Carnegie? Well, he didn't pay any income taxes until the 16th Amendment. Neither did Rockefeller. So this is how I remember it. You get a job when you're 16, you start paying taxes. That's how I remember it. Okay? 16th Amendment, income taxes. So I have asked you to remember 4 amendments so far. The 16th Amendment, the 17th Amendment, the 18th Amendment, and the 21st Amendment. I want you to have those memorized. And there's one more, the 19th Amendment, that's women's suffrage, but that'll be another lesson. Here is a political cartoon. Look at this, United States Treasury, and look at this, Uncle Sam, he's smiling. Why are these rich people crying? Because now they have to pay income taxes. The sign here says, pay your income tax here. No escape from millionaire tax dodgers. So the millionaires are all crying. That's progressivism. All right. The creation of the initiative, referendum, and recall procedures during the progressive era resulted in what? Remember what I said, more people power. Hit pause if you need more time, but the answer is more people power. The expansion of citizens' direct participation in the democratic process. Okay? Because remember, initiative comes from the people. Recall also comes from the people. It doesn't come from Congress. It comes from the people. More people power. The reform which allowed the people to petition for the removal of an elected official. Just like a safety recall, the answer is recall. All right. This is the only time I have ever seen social Darwinism on the EOC. Many progressives opposed social Darwinism because it promoted the idea that what? Remember, social Darwinism is this idea that rich people are rich because they are better than us, and poor people are just dumb and lazy. But progressives are opposed to that idea because social Darwinism promoted the idea that, and this is where progressives disagree, social Darwinism promoted the idea that people in the lower classes were not capable of economic success. That is a confusing question. I do not like that question at all. Okay? All right. During the progressive era, one goal of state-level political reformers was to what? So remember, more people power. We're not talking national government, we're talking about state government. Just think about like initiative, recall, referendum. The answer is C. So direct democracy, more people power. All right, thanks guys. All right, that's it for this lesson.